Okay, the four-part series, which is one heck of a summary of the last 20 months, which is an over-the-top situation in the United States and the world. I'm really cramming to put it into 4 sessions, and I will go as quickly as I can to be able to cram in the events. I broke it down into 4. The first one is called, and obviously you know about it because you read it and saw it and came, it's called the Financial Titanic, which is, I like the analogy to the Titanic because it was a foreign transportation system bringing to the United States at very fast rates with no concern for risk people. It was in this case, what I'm going to be talking about is the global financial system conveying not people to the United States, but conveying financial wealth and financial purchasing power to the United States. So the question becomes, the analogy to the Titanic is, not how you built the ship, but how did you build the conduits for foreign financial accumulation to wash up on our shores, and how did it get invested in our markets and affect prices? That's what today's lecture is about. Just let me very quickly tell you about the coming events of the following 3, all on Tuesday nights, and next time we'll hopefully be more prepared and start on time. And the second one is going to be called Why Economists and Wall Street Missed It. And they certainly missed it to their chagrin and losses. And there's really a systematic reason why they didn't see it come. They believed in a different system than what had happened in the world, and I'm going to cover that next time. The third lecture has to do with, or discussion has to do with the bailouts, whether or not the bailouts are the solution to our problems or indeed another big problem in itself. And that really is beginning to boil up as another big problem in itself. Just attempting to do the bailouts they're doing and the damage they're doing to the U.S. credit rating. So, and also within that third lecture, I'll also be talking about, to some degree, alternatives to these very high-cost bailouts. The last of the series is when will it be over? When can we come out of cover, out of the bomb shelter? And it's not so much when, but what has to be put in place in order to turn the economy around, turn financial markets around. It's a long process, and there are a lot of links in the chain that have to be rebuilt there as well. It's probably, in my estimation, we still got 3 years ahead of us. Just given the timeline of the pillars that have to be rebuilt under the system. So that's the full course. Tonight is the Financial Titanic, which is the conveyor, basically, of foreign capital to the United States. Where did it come from? How come it came out of the blue? How did it affect everything? And once the foreign capital created a boom, and like all booms that are extreme, they get followed by bust because they finance a lot of investment, and in its wake, there's no more need for investment. If you have any question about that, just on your way home, take a look at all the buildings being built downtown that are empty and will be empty for the next decade. That's what happens. Booms, busts follow booms. And what creates the booms typically is heavy-duty financing. There's been a lot of, by the way, misperception as to where the financing came. And if there's a heart to this lecture, it's really about where the financing came from. The story really starts of how this episode of capital gushed over into the United States really starts almost 20 years ago, really like 1990. And it really doesn't, in a place that you would at least be looking, and that is countries that we used to call LDCs. Now, my current students don't know what an LDC is, but some of you do. An LDC is called, we used to call less developed countries, which we now call emerging nations, emerging market nations. And in 1990, the president of Mexico figured out the solution to take a country that was poor with lots of unemployment, very low wage rates, and turn it around and make it into an exporting powerhouse. And basically, that's what I'm going to go through next lecture. some detail of that story, or some more fleshing out of that story. Let us suffice to say at this point, the LDC has figured out how to make themselves into emerging nations. And it was really a great opportunity for them because the level of unemployment was high, the wage rates were extremely low, and if they could attract capital and start producing, they would produce goods that Americans bought, and they were designed for the American market because the American market last year was the U.S. consumer was 18% of total spending in the world. So if you're going to build a product, you build it for the American market. That's 18% of the entire world right here of consumer spending. So they figured out how to get capital, start to produce. They trained their labor force. They started exporting. There were a lot of hurdles they had to jump over, which I'll discuss next time. And they were successful. And Mexico was very successful starting back in 1990, and virtually every country of Latin America almost instantaneously followed the same policies of Mexico. And if you remember, 1990 was also an incredibly important year because that's when the USSR's grasp over the communist countries of East Asia and China and Russia's own socialist bent went away. And so basically that year, we not only had the less developed countries of Latin America, Southeast Asia, and to some small extent that are beginning to be accounted for these days, Africa, but then we also had Eastern Europe. We had China come into the fold and want to be capitalist, and even Russia, though they're quite stubborn about understanding things like rule of law. But nonetheless, today, all those countries, with the two exceptions of the two last holdouts, which would be North Korea and Cuba. And so other than that, they're all capitalists now, and they're all seeking to export and realize they had skills. We didn't realize it because they weren't producing things back in 1990 that were useful to us, but they had skills, and all they needed capital. And if you have labor that's very inexpensive, you can produce products, ship it to America or Europe or Japan, the developed world, and undercut their prices by very substantial amounts, and they did it and succeeded. Now, by doing all that, it affects the United States, and the most adverse immediate impact is we start to have a trade deficit. And we had a mighty trade deficit up till 2 years ago, into 2008, I guess it's 2009, a year ago. Our trade deficit was at the level of almost 6% of GDP. Now, it might sound to you like 6% is not very much, but if you think about it, what a trade deficit does is it takes our income and we spend on foreign products, which then go to pay the salaries and profit of foreign companies. They don't. That 6% gets lost out of our income stream. It doesn't. Our income, 6% of it gets spent on foreign products, so they get the next round of income rather than the United States. So basically, you're bleeding at the rate of 6% a year. Now, you might say that's not a very large number. Well, you got to realize that the GDP growth in a boom year, we're going forward maybe 4 or 5% at a real boom year, and a recession is -1. So that's the whole range from +5 to -1, from prosperity to where we are. And so that's at the margin, it's a huge number. So the trade deficit that was created because of the effective marshaling of capital resources abroad and their ability to effectively export left the United States in what should have been a major recession. When you got a 6% GDP trade deficit, we should have breadlines. Effectively, it's like today. Now, except it didn't happen. By the way, in all this, I want to say I'm kind of dealing now with the time period of 2002 to 2007. That's the time period I want to talk about, the post-tech time period. And this is the period of time when the emerging nations became very successful. They became very successful in their exporting and to the U.S. market. I'd say starting about 2002. They were very successful in the 1990s, and then they had a problem, namely capital fled, and then it came back again in 2002. And then so this is the time period from 2002 to 2008, actually. If they're successful at trade, they're going to run They will run trade surpluses. We run trade deficits. We're supposed to be in a recession, but it didn't happen. So the question is, why did it not happen? Most people were oblivious to this because we didn't have a recession. In fact, we had a prosperity. And the question is, how in the world can we have a prosperity in the face of that size a trade deficit? And what happened was that our trade deficit was a trade surplus to them, which created a lot of jobs, a lot of income, a lot of profitability. It started out in manufacturing. It started out in Latin America. Then it went to China. And then once you go and American firms start to outsource. And so manufacturing base of the U.S. has basically shifted to the emerging nations. And then on top of that, in the last few years, it spread in the sense that it created a worldwide economic boom. In fact, I think the year 2007 or 8, I forgot which, we had the fastest growth rate of GDP in the world in the post-war period. We don't have data on pre-World War II, but since World War II, it was the fastest worldwide growth rate. I think in real terms it was 5.6% growth rate. Now, what happens is they start producing for the developed world end products, but they also start creating demand for raw materials, energy, food, commodities. And we had that commodity boom in 07, 08, maybe even starting 06. And so then other countries were brought into it, like the Middle East, like Saudi Arabia and the OPEC countries. And they mightily also exported, and their income was high. They didn't manufacture, but they sold raw materials. So basically, they got caught into it as well and got swept up into the worldwide economic boom. And now the question is, how did the United States avoid recession in the face of this worldwide boom? Well, the high levels of income abroad led to, surprisingly, very high savings rate. And if I'll tell you what the savings rate is, kind of amaze you. The emerging markets were saving at about 30% of income. Let me say that again, 30%. The U.S. personal savings rate, in contrast, this is 05, 06, 07, 08, we were down to zero or negative. So they were saving 30%. So basically what was happening is all the world accumulation of capital was happening abroad. And then the question becomes, of that capital that was accumulated, where was it allocated? Well, their preference, and this is one of the most interesting parts of this whole thing, their preference was about 80% share of their capital got allocated to the United States, was allocated to the U.S. And why? Well, the reason is, when you have your first wealth, you try to invest it conservatively and put it in a country that has the longest track record of success, a high level of what's called rule of law, relatively containable inflation rates, and we have a long history of not having a sovereign defaults, which plagued many other countries. So they like the United States for all those reasons, even though basically we're supposed to be in a recession. But they were conservative. In fact, the accumulators of the wealth were really like 3 or 4 parts. And I'm going to explain this chain, but the foreign saver that accumulated the savings, and they accumulated net worth. And who were they? They were sovereign wealth funds, is where the Saudi Arabia, any country that was exporting minerals or energy, virtually always owned by the governments. So the savings was government savings, and they put that wealth into what was newly created sovereign wealth funds. Then foreign central banks, which I'll discuss in a second, were also major savers abroad who were investing in the United States. And let me go back and pick that up. I should have covered that before. Foreign individuals, foreign corporations. And basically what they did, and this is their balance sheet, they have net worth, and what they effectively wanted were deposits. And the deposits were deposits at foreign banks. And the foreign banks it would be, depending on the bank of choice of that particular country, if it were Saudi money, it was likely UK banks. If it were Chinese individuals, it would likely be a Hong Kong bank. If it were the Swiss, a lot of the money came through if they're Eastern Europe, it came through the Swiss banks, etc. So these newly wealthy individuals Their balance sheet built up with wealth. They wanted deposits at conservative banks. They went to foreign banks who accepted their deposits. And I'll get to the story in a few minutes, but the foreign banks in turn were looking for, and here's the irony of the whole thing, they were looking for very conservative investments. So they were looking for AAA and AA investments of various kinds that investment bankers in the United States ended up building specifically for them. And so that's one of the great ironies. Now, one link of the story I left out. Not only did the success of trade generate savings, but I also threw in the idea of foreign central banks.